Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at this really interesting concept, cultural whitening in the Philippines.
Oh, interesting.
We're going to be using an academic journal article to kind of guide us along.
Okay.
The article is called Cultural Whitening, Mobility, and Differentiation: Lived Experiences of Filipino Wives to White Men.
Okay.
It's by Janet M. Arnado,
Mm-hmm.
and it's from the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, isn't whitening just about skin bleaching?
Yeah, that's what I would think.
But we're going to learn today that it's actually way more complicated than that.
Okay.
We're going to look at how this plays out for Filipino women married to white men, and we're going to look at what it means for Filipino identity in a world that's, increasingly influenced by globalization and Western culture.
Okay, sounds good.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, great.
Well, the article really kind of throws a wrench in the works for that simplistic view of whitening. Arnado, the author, she argues that it's not just about skin color, but it's about a bunch of different things. Behaviors, values, aspirations, even the stuff that people choose to buy.
Really?
Yeah, it's about Filipinos copying traits that have historically been associated with, white colonizers.
Oh, wow.
And more recently, Western culture and the Filipino mestizo elite.
So it's not like they're trying to actually become white. It sounds more like they're trying to adopt these aspects of whiteness to sort of get ahead.
Exactly.
Economically, socially, is that what you mean?
Yeah, they're trying to climb that ladder.
Okay.
And the article actually uses this phrase. It says, almost the same, but not quite.
Wow.
It's this idea that they're striving for whiteness, but they always remain a little bit on the outside. It's really interesting, this paradox.
That's a really powerful image, you know?
Yeah.
Almost the same, but not quite. It really kind of sums up what we're trying to explore here.
Yeah.
How are people navigating these really complicated questions of identity in a world that's, so globalized?
Absolutely.
So the article breaks down cultural whitening into 3 states: embodied, objectified, and institutionalized.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious to hear what would be some real world examples of how these states actually happen.
Okay, well, let's start with embodied whitening.
Okay.
So you know how there's this huge preference in Filipino culture for having lighter skin? Or think about the way that some Filipinos speak, using Konyo, that mix of Tagalog, English, and Spanish.
Yeah.
That's usually associated with the elite. So that's what embodied whitening would be. Internalized dispositions, tastes, all of that just reflect this maybe even subconscious desire for whiteness.
See, that's fascinating to me because, Kanyo isn't just a language. It's like a cultural identifier. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It immediately makes you think of wealth, status, and, a certain degree of closeness to whiteness, I guess.
Right. And it really shows how deeply ingrained that desire for whiteness is in Filipino society. Okay, now if we go to objectified whitening, that's a little more tangible. It's about what you actually buy and what you put around you.
Okay.
So things like Western food, movies, cars, houses, and then obviously skin whitening products.
So you're saying it's like trying to prove that you have access to these things, to these markers of Western culture?
Exactly.
To show that you're closer to this ideal.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and then we have the big one, which is institutionalized whitening.
Okay.
This is about having those formal ties to whiteness. Things like, getting a Western education, marrying a white man, moving to a Western country, even getting citizenship in a Western country.
And I think the reason why the article focuses specifically on Filipinas who are married to white men is because they kind of embody all 3 of those states of whitening, wouldn't you say?
That's exactly right. They embody both cultural and biological whitening, especially when they have, mixed race kids. And the article makes this point that Filipinos are particularly, kind of key players in all of this, in this process, because of societal pressures and opportunities that are kind of connected to their gender.
I see. It's interesting, too, how this dynamic plays out in a different way depending on whether they move to the West or if they stay in the Philippines.
Right.
So why don't we start with the women who migrate first? The article introduces us to Esme, who went from being a live-in caregiver in Canada to becoming a director of care.
Wow.
She even got Canadian citizenship, and she adopted a lot of, Canadian ways of life. And she eventually became even more successful than her husband in her career.
Yeah.
It's quite a story. Yeah.
It is, and it really highlights how migration can speed up that process of cultural whitening. Esme's journey is a perfect example of that upward mobility and assimilation that people usually connect with marrying a white man and moving to the West.
But it seems like not all stories are as, straightforward as Esme's.
Yeah.
The article also tells us about Cecile, who lives in Denmark.
Oh, okay.
Now, her marriage is less traditional.
Yeah.
They share finances and responsibilities, and it seems like she's adopted a very Danish lifestyle, to the point that she's even given up some of her religious beliefs.
So Cecile's story kind of adds another layer to how we look at cultural whitening.
Okay.
It's not just about copying, one specific Western ideal. It's also about adapting to the norms and the values of whatever country you happen to be in.
Yeah, it's very specific.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And then we have Esther.
Okay.
Now, she's super educated, but she chose to stay at home with her kids in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And what she's done is she's incorporated both German and Japanese cultural elements into her home.
Wow.
She seems pretty happy with that lifestyle, which, you don't see that often with someone with her background in the Philippines.
Yeah, that is interesting.
What's so cool about Esther's case is it shows that even within this whole cultural whitening thing, people still have their own choices and their own agency.
Okay, yeah, I see that. So those are just 3 examples, but they already show how different the experiences can be for Filipinos who are married to white men.
Right.
It's not like a one-size-fits-all thing.
No.
And every woman figures out this complicated identity thing in her own way.
Exactly. And that's so important to remember.
Yeah.
And also that it's not like a straight line.
Got it.
It's messy, it's nuanced, and it's full of these contradictions.
I see.
Yeah.
So now I want to kind of shift our focus to Filipinas who marry white men, but they stay in the Philippines.
Yeah, okay.
Their experiences are interesting because they show us a whole different side to this whole cultural whitening thing.
Yeah, it's like a localized version of it,
Right.
shaped by how they interact with the expat community and what specific economic things they're pursuing.
So the article introduces us to Irma and Kathy. They're both entrepreneurs who got married looking for love and security.
Makes sense.
They run their own businesses, and they're in contact with the white expat community, all the time.
So their whitening is connected to, their social circles and
Yeah.
what they do to make money all within the Philippines.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So they're not, fully immersed in Western culture in the same way that someone who migrated would be.
Right.
But their lives still touch it
They intersect, yeah.
in big ways.
Exactly.
Okay. And then there's Cindy.
Okay.
She's in a long-term relationship with an older white guy who supports her financially.
Interesting.
And her case is really interesting because it shows how whitening can be on a scale.
Yeah, spectrum.
It's not like you're either doing it or you're not.
Right.
It really shows how money is a big part of these desires for whiteness.
Absolutely.
So we're seeing this mix of,
Yeah.
personal choices, societal pressures, chance to make more money, and then that, lasting impact of colonialism.
Yeah, it's all kind of woven together.
All these things add up to this phenomenon that's changing what it even means to be Filipino today.
It really is.
It makes me wonder, though, what happens because of all this?
Mm.
The article talks about upward mobility and differentiation.
Right.
But is there a bad side?
That's the big question, right? And the article really digs into it.
Okay.
So these women are moving up in the world,
Uh-huh.
but then there's the question of what they have to leave behind.
Could they be losing their Filipino identity?
It's definitely something to think about. The article suggests that there are different levels of how disconnected they become from Filipino culture.
Okay.
Like Esme gave up her Filipino citizenship.
Oh.
And then you have Esther, who kept hers, but she talks about not feeling connected to Filipino communities.
That's interesting.
And then there's Cindy, who isn't really exposed to much Filipino culture.
Uh-huh.
So she shows how you can have whitening without really being involved in Filipino traditions.
Okay, got it.
And then there's this whole idea of passing.
What does that mean?
So some of these women might look white in some situations.
Oh, I see.
And that makes things even more complicated when it comes to identity.
Yeah, it really messes with our ideas
Mm-hmm.
about what it means to belong to a certain culture or racial group.
It really does. And this leads to a point that the article brings up. Could cultural whitening actually become the new normal in the Philippines?
Whoa, that's a big idea. But it makes sense when you think about how strong globalization is and how cultural ideas are always mixing.
Imagine a future where the things that make you successful and desirable are so tied to being white
Mm-hmm.
that it's not even called whitening anymore. It's just being Filipino.
That's a really deep thought. It would definitely change how we understand Filipino identity.
Absolutely.
And it makes you ask even more questions.
Yeah.
Like what happens when those traditional things that make up an identity get blurry? Is this like assimilation, or is it something completely different?
Those are the questions we have to ask.
We're seeing this back and forth between wanting some parts of Western culture, but also holding on to Filipino pride.
Like Irma and Cecile, right?
Right.
They don't want to say their husbands had a big influence on them.
Yeah.
They want to emphasize that they're the ones responsible for their own success.
And Esme, even though she's living that Canadian life,
Yeah.
she still cooks Filipino food.
Exactly. It shows that even when you're whitening, you don't have to completely give up who you are.
It's like they're making their own space
Yeah.
in this complicated world of culture, mixing Filipino and Western influences.
And it brings up another question. Could this create like a ranking system within Filipino society?
Like some people are seen as more whitened than others.
Exactly. And if certain traits and behaviors get linked with whiteness,
Right.
and therefore with success and being desirable,
Then it could cause divisions and inequality.
it's a really important point. It shows how this whole thing could have social consequences.
This deep dive is making us think about how complicated cultural exchange is in a globalized world.
And it's a reminder that these things aren't just happening in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Cultural whitening or something like it could be happening in different ways all over the world.
As we keep looking at these individual stories and think about the bigger questions, one thing is clear. Cultural whitening isn't a simple issue.
It's really not.
It's nuanced, it's multifaceted, and it's shaped by so many things. History, economics, societal pressures, and individual choices.
It really is.
And it makes us ask really fundamental questions about identity, belonging, and what culture will look like in the future in a world that's so interconnected.
Absolutely.
This whole deep dive into cultural whitening in the Philippines has been so interesting.
Yeah, it's really made us think about what we believe and see things from the point of view of people who are actually living through these cultural changes.
It's true. Like the article doesn't say for sure whether cultural whitening is just assimilation or something else entirely.
That's what makes it so interesting, right? Can you be part of another culture without giving up your own?
The women in the article, they all seem to be figuring that out in their own ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Esme, she lives a Canadian life now, but still holds on to some Filipino traditions.
And Esther, even though she's in Germany, she's kept her Filipino citizenship.
Right.
And she has this mix of German and Japanese culture in her home.
Like a blend of everything.
It is.
Their stories show that identity is really fluid in a globalized world.
It's not black and white.
They're not just assimilating, they're creating these new identities that take from different cultures.
That makes me wonder, what does this mean for Filipino identity as a whole?
Yeah.
If cultural whitening in all its forms becomes the norm, how will that change how Filipinos see themselves?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
It goes beyond individual choices.
Right.
And makes us think about what it means to be Filipino in this day and age.
Exactly. Will it make Filipino identity more diverse and inclusive? Or will it all become the same?
Like, will we lose those unique things that make someone Filipino?
That's the big question.
The article doesn't give us the answers,
It doesn't.
but it helps us understand what's shaping Filipino identity today.
It really does.
And it makes us think about if similar things are happening in other cultures around the world. Like, how do people define who they are when cultural lines are getting blurry?
Right. Are there good things and bad things that come with that?
And what does it mean for the future of cultures that are different from each other? Will we be able to keep those unique traditions alive?
Big questions.
They really are.
Yeah.
This whole look into cultural whitening has been really eye-opening for me.
Me too.
I've had to question what I thought I knew.
Yeah.
And I've learned so much about Filipino culture.
It makes you think.
It really does.
Yeah.
So as we wrap things up here, we want to leave you with one last thought.
If cultural whitening is changing what it means to be Filipino,
What does that tell us about how cultures mix and change in a globalized world?
are other societies going through the same kind of blending and adaptation?
What are the pros and cons? And in the end, what does it mean for the future of different cultures and those special traditions that make them unique?
Keep thinking about these questions.
Yeah, keep the conversation going.
And dive deep into these topics.
Until next time.
Yeah, see you then.